Well, good evening, everyone. I am going to go ahead and get started on our review tonight. For those of you who are joining late, watching this at a later time, I apologize that I did start earlier tonight. It's just that there's so much to cover in this unit. I wanted to make sure that I was able to get it all in. So we are going to be covering time period 6 tonight, which covers 1865 to 1898. That's also known as the Gilded Age in American history. We're also going to sprinkle a little of the next time period into this review because what I do is I combine the Gilded Age with the Progressive Era. So we'll go through the Gilded Age and then conclude with the Progressive Era, and that should get you ready for your Unit 6 exam. As usual, we're going to go through the big ideas that we typically talk about as we go through each time period. But if you notice, I'm going to go here to this screen here, and hopefully it works, and it's working pretty well. We're the focus of period 6. There's a lot of change going on in our country. So we're coming out of the Reconstruction era. We're still really trying to rebuild our country after the Civil War. But what I tell my students, and I'll tell you guys, there are several different timelines occurring at the exact same time in American history. So we're looking at a timeline for westward expansion. We're looking at industrialization. We're looking at, urbanization, immigration. All of these things are occurring during this time period, and they're all occurring at the same time. I think that's what makes this particular unit a little difficult to grasp, because you're trying to kind of put everything together at the same time, and sometimes they're connected and sometimes they're not. So what I'm going to do is try my best to take you through this unit in a somewhat organized fashion. As I said, we're going to be talking about westward expansion, the nationalization of our industry, and all of this growth is going to lead to a growing divide between the social classes in our country. Names you should know, and like I said, I just have a few on the screen here, but I have Andrew Carnegie, William Boss Tweed, Booker T. Washington, Sitting Bull, William Jennings Bryan, but we can talk about Rockefeller, we can talk about we were talking about McKinley in class today, but we can talk about the presidents and everything that's going on. So there's a whole lot going on. And the only way we're going to get through it if we just dive in. So we're going to hit big idea number 1. Oops, hit it twice. Sorry about that. What the heck? Doesn't want to stay on big idea number 1. Let's go back. There we go. Okay. Big idea number 1. In this period, continued westward migration and the advent of the transcontinental railroad systems helped to unify the nation's economy in many cases in favor of the industrialists at the expense of the farmers. Westward expansion has always been a major part of our nation's identity. And what we're going to see during the Gilded Age is we're going to see westward migration essentially come to an end. This is driven by the growth of our government's influence on westward expansion during the Civil War. You remember during the Civil War, we literally just had one-party rule. And so a lot of legislation was able to be passed during this time period, including the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act and the Morrill Land Grant Act. And so that's going to basically bump or boost westward expansion going into the later 1860s and the 1870s. So we're going to see the growth of our government influence lead to like this 5-fold expansion of our railroads. And we're going to create this national market during this time period. And what we'll see as a result of this national market being created is the combination of mass production in industry and mass consumption by American citizens. We're going to become a consumer-based nation. With the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, we're going to interconnect our national economy, and it's going to stretch from coast to coast. And the railroad will actually provide that final push we need to complete westward expansion. Consumerism is going to grow due to all of the goods that we're going to start being able to produce and transport across the country. And the more widely available new products become, the greater the demand is. I mean, the demand starts to grow more and more for these goods, and the railroad is just going to, boost that demand. The government is going to support the building of railroads through economic grants, through land grants, really cheap loans. The railroads as they're going to be built, you're going to see over 170 million acres put in the control of all these different railroads. And once they have that land, they can do whatever they want with it. They build their railroad, and then they can use the rest of the land to sell, or they can lease it, or, like I said, it's their land to use. The first transcontinental railroad is going to be built and come to a connection between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad at Promontory Point, Utah. However, this is not the only transcontinental railroad that's going to be built. We're going to see 4 different transcontinental railroads be built in our country, and these are going to continue to help grow our economy in our country as well. However, we are going to run into some economic problems during this time period. 2 major economic panics are going to hit the United States. The first one being the Panic of 1873, the second one being the Panic of 1893. And I want to key in on the Panic of 1893 as it relates to railroads. I mentioned there was 4 transcontinental railroads. And after the Panic of 1893, we're going to see 25% of our railroads essentially go belly up, go bankrupt, and start shutting down. And they become very cheap to buy. And what you have is you have savvy investors who are going to look at these railroads who can't sustain themselves, and they're going to start buying these railroads up. By the end of the Gilded Age, by 1900, large corporations have taken control of many of the railroads, taking advantage of that economic downturn after the Panic of 1893. And what we're going to see is that by 1900, by the turn of the century, 2/3 of the railroad industry is being controlled by 7 different trusts. These are regional monopolies that have taken control of the railroads, and we see that happening throughout our country. But the big thing, the big idea right here that we're talking about is the value and the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad and what it did to unify our nation, not only economically, but politically and socially as well. And it is, like I said, going to be at the expense of the farmers. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Okay? So let's go ahead and move on to big idea number 2. Big idea number 2 says technological innovation created the occasion for the rise and expansion of industrial capitalism. Technology, we're going through a second industrial revolution, and technology is booming. New ideas, new inventions, new research is being done, and it's just going to contribute to this growing economy and this growing industrialized society that we are starting to create in the United States. One of the first major effectual inventions that's going to come up is going to be the Bessemer-Kelley process. The Bessemer-Kelley process was a method of producing steel where you essentially blew cold air through molten iron. And the result of that is going to be a high quality, strong steel. Now, I don't know why it worked, but it worked. And we're going to see steel become the primary construction material that's going to be started to use throughout our country. And one of the first places we're going to use it is on the railroads. We're going to start replacing all the rail lines, the iron lines, with steel tracks. And that's going to help boost, obviously, the steel industry. And the person who benefits the most from this is going to be Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie had embraced the Bessemer-Kelley process. He had brought it to his steel mills in Pennsylvania, and he was the top producer of steel in the mid to late 1800s. And he is going to build the steel industry. He's going to build his corporations based on the economic principle of vertical integration. Now, vertical integration, essentially what Carnegie did was he amassed all the key components of producing steel, including the mining operations, the steel mills, the distribution methods, the methods of distributing the steel once it was created. And he put this all under one company. So he owned, or he controlled, essentially every stage of production of steel. And what this did was this increased the efficiency and the profit that he was making. And he built his own steel monopoly doing it this way. There was another form of economic integration that was used in many of the corporations, and this is what we call horizontal integration. Now, horizontal integration differs from vertical integration in that horizontal integration uses essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to control one aspect of production of a specific product. So you control essentially, whatever level of production you want to, you control everything there. And the person who basically perfected this was J.D. Rockefeller. J.D. Rockefeller is going to use a lot of anti-competitive and underhanded pricing tactics to essentially drive other oil refineries out of business, because that was his business, Standard Oil. They refined oil. And he's going to use all of these practices to essentially, he underpriced everyone, driving all the other refineries to the point of bankruptcy. And then he started buying up all these refineries. And at one point, Standard Oil and J.D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of the oil in our country through using this version of horizontal integration. He controlled basically the refining of oil. Now, these are two of the major players during the industrial era, Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller. But there were others that got involved in all of this as well, and they had the same type of practices. But if you know those two guys, honestly, I think you're doing pretty good. What's helping these guys? What's allowing them to build these industries, to build these monopolies and control various aspects of different industries throughout the United States is the standpoint of the U.S. government of what we call laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is essentially the government is keeping its hands off any type of approach to the economy. The government's going to let competition and the competitive forces within our economy basically, go against each other, and they're just going to stay out of the fray. And what this is going to do is it's going to create this capitalistic environment that encourages people to get involved in the economy, but doesn't try to rein anybody in if they get too strong or they have too much control. Essentially, the capitalists, the monopolists, they are going to dictate what the market does. And the government's just going to sit back and allow this to happen. Now, there was a lot of success for the individuals, but at some point, the government's going to start looking into it and say, man, maybe we should kind of try to rein this in. Adam Smith is a famous economist who he argued early in he was part of the Enlightenment period, but he argued against mercantilism, and he always argued for competition, because competition drives producers and manufacturers and creators of products. Competition drives them to create the best products they can, because they want to be able to get the most buy-in for their products. So if you're competing with somebody and you're both making, like say you're both making iPhones, everyone's making a phone. There's a competition to see who can make the best phone. And the competition drives us, so we want to get the best product out there ahead of our competitors. And so Adam Smith said this competition was good. But what starts to happen in the Gilded Age is, because of the laissez-faire policies of government, competition just doesn't exist anymore, because you have the Carnegies controlling the steel production. You have the Rockefellers controlling oil. And though they are putting out good products, there is not very much competition to drive them even further. What drove them was a personal drive from within. And always they were driven always to be the best, and they always wanted to one up the next guy trying to come up the ladder. So they had their own personal drive, but it wasn't the competitive drive that Adam Smith always talked about. Now, the government is going to get involved. They are going to pass what's known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Sherman Antitrust Act was put into play to combat these monopolies, to try to rein in their power and try to control them a little bit. But unless you just go all in, it's going to be difficult to control them. Now, why would these guys do this? Why, did they ever have any guilt? Did they ever feel bad because they were controlling these markets? And the simple answer, I guess, is no. Because they attributed their success to a theory called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was an application of Charles Darwin's biological theory in human society, and this notion that the survival of the fittest is what's best for our economy. And Carnegie and Rockefeller would argue that the sacrifice of these smaller companies was necessary because it made them stronger. I talk about in my class, there's a cartoon, and I wish I had it here, but I don't, of Andrew Carnegie and the American Beauty Rose. And Carnegie is standing there with shears, and there's a whole bunch of little buds and flowers all on the ground beneath this one single rose. And he says that the sacrifice of these little buds and these branches was necessary to create the perfect bloom on the American Beauty Rose. So Rockefeller, using that same analogy, would say, me taking over all those smaller refineries, me pushing them out of business so that I could control the refining operation of oil in our country, that was necessary in order for the United States to have the best quality oil that Rockefeller Oil is producing, that Standard Oil is putting out. And, it's too bad about those guys who weren't able to survive. But this is a dog-eat-dog world, and this is survival of the fittest. And I was the one who came out on top. The world's wealthiest, though, what we start to see happen is that those in power, who were primarily Anglo-American capitalists, they're going to continue to justify their success and their wealth with this theory. And the problem was that's going to roll into is it's going to kind of grow into racist ideologies. It's also going to roll into nativist ideologies. And it's not going to be what's best for our country moving forward. What's going on in the United States and during the Gilded Age is the world's wealthiest are controlling the money. They're going to say that's what's best for society. Now, Andrew Carnegie is going to write an essay called The Gospel of Wealth. And he's going to argue that the world being wealthy, him being wealthy, is what's best for society, because he believed that you needed that men were chosen by God to be wealthy because God knew that they would be responsible with that wealth. And according to Carnegie, you had to use your wealth if you were a good Christian. And Carnegie personally justified all of his wealth by investing in society. He's going to do a lot of philanthropic projects. He's going to give a lot of donations out through these projects, things like Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Mellon University, he's going to put a Carnegie Library in almost every city and town in the country. And so that's what he said. He goes, I was given this wealth so I could do this good for society. And Rockefeller will kind of fall along the same suit. I mean, you've heard of Rockefeller Center and stuff like that. So while they argued that they were who they were due to social Darwinism, due to the fact that they were the strongest, that they were the fittest as far as, business in America, they said that it's okay because we are using our wealth to benefit society as a whole. So you might not have all the wealth that we do, but you are still benefiting from what we do. And that was kind of the idea behind that. Okay? All right. Big idea number 3. While some American standards of living improved, many in the labor sector found their lives unsustainable and they fought for better treatment. The standard of living starts to rise during the Gilded Age, and a new middle class is going to start to develop. Essentially, this middle class is what we refer to today as white-collar workers. These are the salesmen and the managers in our economic system. But we also had a laboring class. These were the blue-collar workers of the Gilded Age, and they worked for wages that really weren't sustainable for their lives. Their one income could not support, or sometimes didn't support, a single family. So you did start to see women and young children entering into the workforce. And as a result of this, you're going to see organizations start to come together to essentially represent this working class. And I'm talking about the rise of the labor unions. Labor unions are when workers come together and unionize. They create an organization in order to work towards improving their wages and improving their working conditions. And I've said it time and time again. What laborers were always looking for was more money, shorter work days, and better working conditions. Across the board, that was essentially always going to be their goal. But during the Gilded Age, it was much more. It wasn't as simple as that. Yes, they wanted those three things, but they're also dealing with the problems of just working in these factories. There was working in the factories. You had a lot of higher injury rates. You had deaths. People were dying in the factory. And it didn't seem like there was much of a response from ownership because there were plenty of workers available to take the place of their injured workers or the workers that lost their lives on the job. And the workers, because there was such a large supply of laborers in America, they really had no power to negotiate for higher wages or better work conditions and stuff like that. And so that's when they're going to start organizing and trying to form unions. Maybe they would have more power and a louder voice if they all banded together, if they all worked together towards the exact same goals. Excuse me just a second here. Okay. So anyway, this is going to essentially start to come to fruition. You're going to start seeing these workers work together, form these unions, and start using the only tool they really had to fight against, their, to low wages and working conditions and stuff like that. And that's the labor strike, when they would just stop working. And the very first strike you should be aware of is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The railroads had cut their wages. I'd mentioned earlier that there was an economic panic in 1873. As a result of that, profit margins went down. Companies weren't making much money. So and typically companies, the very first thing they do when they're not making much money is they start to cut wages. The railroads followed suit. The railroads cut their wages, and that's going to have workers band together in a railroad union and go on strike. And you had railroad workers striking in 11 different states. And that essentially is going to shut down the commerce of America. If you shut down the railroads, you shut down the economy at this point in history. So 60% of the railroads were shut down due to this railroad strike. Just get that picture in your head. Over half of the railroads in our country were not running due to the strike. President Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, is going to respond to this strike by sending federal troops in to force the workers back to work. Now, he is going to argue that he has the right to do that because the Constitution grants the federal government power to control interstate commerce, and the Commerce Clause gives them that ability. And so we're going to see he's going to use federal troops to put down that strike. And essentially that's going to end that strike. But that's not going to be the first strike where federal troops are going to be used. Jump ahead to the 1890s when the Pullman Rail Company goes on strike. The Pullman strike was the same situation. The Pullman Company cut wages, and in this case, what's interesting is most of the Pullman employees lived in the Pullman town, and they rented their homes from the Pullman Company. So the Pullman Company reduces their wages, but doesn't reduce their rent. So it's almost like they're losing money on both ends of their lives. And when the workers tried to negotiate for a higher wage, they were fired. And so Eugene V. Debs is going to step in, and he's going to direct the railroad union to go on strike in protest of how the Pullman Car Company employees are being treated. And what they did was what the federal government did is they started linking the Pullman cars to the mail cars. And in doing that, that gave the federal government the power to come in and use the military to put down yet another strike. Now, the government had actually issued an injunction against the strike and had ordered the workers to go back to work. But Eugene V. Debs, the leader of this, he is going to refuse the injunction. And because of that, he's actually going to end up in jail. And then, of course, we talked about in class, while he's in jail, he reads the Communist Manifesto and he becomes a socialist. And then he's going to become the face and the voice of socialism in America going forward. So these are some of the railroad unions. Other unions you might want to be familiar with. The Knights of Labor. They were formed in early 1880s. They were a national union. They had membership that was open to all. They were what we called an industrial union. There were no limitations for who could be in that union. As long as you had a job, you could join them. You also had the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor, they're going to be a craft union. So you had to have a specific skill in order to be in that union. These are the two big ones you need to know. The Knights of Labor, one more strike we should talk about, or not even a strike, it was more of a protest, and that's going to be the Haymarket Square protest. That's going to happen in Chicago, and that's going to be members of the Knights of Labor who are going to come together in a protest against, or protest for, the 8-hour workday. While this protest was going on, the police went in to break it up because it was getting late into the evening, and someone, an anarchist, is going to throw a bomb into the middle of the crowd. And what's going to happen as a result of this is a lot of people are going to start looking at unions and kind of comparing them or aligning them with socialist and anarchist behavior. And so you're going to see the public slowly start to turn against the unions. In fact, after the Haymarket Square riot, when this bomb went off and police officers were killed and it was discovered that anarchists are the ones who bombed it, the Knights of Labor are essentially going to disband because everyone's giving up their membership in this union because they don't want to be associated with socialism or anarchy. So that was kind of the end of that union. I mentioned the American Federation of Labor. That's going to be led by Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers, as their union leader, is going to, oversee any strikes and stuff they go on. I guess you could almost say that the AFL was kind of a successor to the Knights of Labor. It will become the largest labor union in the country. It was an association of craft unions. They had over 1 million members. Later, not during the Gilded Age, but later they are going to align with the CIO. So the AFL-CIO, the CIO was an industrial union, and they're going to come together on the same umbrella, and these unions still exist today. The most important thing about unions, why they're so important to the laborers, is as a union, you have the power to do what's called collective bargaining. And collective bargaining is essentially when union members and and management sit down at a table and they negotiate through the different challenges that both sides face. Like I said, union members always want better wages, they want shorter work days, and they want better working conditions. Business owners want lower wages, they want longer work days, and they want to, the conditions to be what the conditions are. They don't want to invest more money into their business. They're about the profit. Both sides are always looking for more. And any time that one side gets more, it's the consumer that absorbs that cost. So the unions, the management, they always go after each other in collective bargaining, but in the end, it's always the consumer who pays the price for what's going on. All right, that's labor unions. That's big idea number 3. Big idea number 4. The industrial workforce expanded and became more diverse through internal and international migration. As immigration increased during the Gilded Age, immigrants faced opposition from nativist and labor unions, but found help through private welfare programs like settlement houses. Okay, so here we're talking about this wave of immigrants that is coming into our country. During the second half of the 1800s, we're going to see nearly 16 million people come into the United States. Now, initially, we've always had immigrants coming in throughout the 1800s. The first group of immigrants we refer to as the old immigrants. And these immigrants came from Ireland, and they came from Germany, and they came from Scandinavia, mostly Western European nations. In the late 19th century, so the second half of the 1800s, we're going to see the immigration wave shift to what we call the new immigrants. And the new immigrants are coming to America from Eastern and Southern Europe. They're coming from Russia. They're coming from Italy. They're coming from Greece. They're coming, just that Southern Eastern European region. They're coming here for the same reason other immigrants came. In the old wave. They're coming to escape growing poverty in Europe. They're coming to escape joblessness. Religious persecution is something else they're facing. And America has always presented this land of opportunity, this land of freedom. And so they're coming for the exact same reasons that everyone else has come in the past. Interestingly, the unions oppose immigrants. Remember, the unions are negotiating for their workers, and these immigrants present a threat to the workers because these immigrants represent replacement workers. So how can the union have power to negotiate when there's a whole other batch of workers ready and willing to come in if the union's laborers are walking off the job? So you're going to start seeing a lot of nativist backlash towards the immigrants from the unions as well as from other Americans. Because, like I said, the immigrants were a competitive threat in the workforce. They were typically unskilled, and they were willing to work for whatever they could get. They're trying to start their lives. So if that means they're going to take half the pay that the other workers are getting, they're going to do it just to have a job. This rise of nativism, though, I do want to touch briefly on that because that is something that really started in the last time period, carried through time period 6, and will continue into the 20th century. Nativism is all about protecting the interests of the, quote, native-born Americans, those folks who were born here. You will see different organizations be formed under this banner of nativism. One of them is like the American Protective Association that took an anti-Catholic stance. They were, I guess, prejudiced against the Irish. They were prejudiced against the Italians. They were prejudiced against the Polish. It was just across the board. And they also used social Darwinism to support or prop up their nativist ideals. That at one point they were saying the Irish were racially inferior to native-born Americans and comparable to the African American community as well. So this was going on. So this nativist backlash that you found coming from unions directed at all these new immigrants coming to our country is something that, like I said, started in period 4 or period 5, continues in period 6, and will continue into period 7 as well. So make sure you understand nativism because it's not going away. That takes me to, whoops, that just jumped ahead. Big idea number 5. Americans move westward for a variety of reasons. Including economic opportunity, self-sufficiency, but the continued push west led to the increasingly bitter conflicts with the American Indians living in those lands. All right, we are going to backtrack a little bit to go back to westward expansion and the effect that that's going to have on America. 1865, after the Civil War, we're going to see Americans start pushing westward. They're focused on expanding. They're focused on opportunity. And the West offers them a lot of opportunity because of that idea of self-sufficiency, independence. And once the railroads are being built, that's going to provide much easier transport out west. Gone are the days of the wagon trains. We saw that when Manifest Destiny was introduced in like the late 1830s and the 1840s. While some people are still taking the wagon trains out, once those railroads get built, it's a lot easier and a lot quicker to get where you need to go in the west to start your new life over. But there's going to be a group of people who are going to be discriminated against in the West. Though they came in to help us build the railroads, you're going to see another wave of immigrants coming from not from Western Europe or Eastern Europe, but from Asia. We're going to see a lot of Asians coming to the American West. They came first to help build the railroads. Then they're going to help start working in the mines once gold is discovered. And like other immigrants, the Asians, specifically the Chinese, are willing to work for a lot less money than other American miners. So you're going to see another rise of nativism, this time not in the East with the industrialists, but in the West with the miners and, the railroad workers and stuff like that. This is going to lead to the passage of one of our very first immigration laws, and that's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, this was prompted from lobbyists for the nativist as well as labor unions to basically ban Chinese immigration into the United States. It is the first immigration law that we created in this country targeting a specific nationality. The Chinese Exclusion Act essentially shut the door to Chinese exclusion, or to Chinese immigration. Make sure you know that law, okay? Another effect or another part of westward expansion is going to be the rise of the lore of the cowboys, the cowboy culture, and that's going to come from a short period of time when the cattle drives are going to be prevalent in the West, specifically in Texas and Kansas, New Mexico, Arizona, that area there. And the cattle drives are going to be benefit from the building of the railroads, because the railroads are going to offer direct access to, direct access to the meat processing plants in Chicago and others in the East. So Kansas City, Dodge City, these places are going to become major cattle hubs where the cattle drives are going to go into. But the cattle drive culture is not going to last as long as you think it does, or as long as the movies tell us it does, because over time we're going to experience a lot of overgrazing that's going to make the drives more difficult. And the more homesteaders that start moving west what they're going to start doing is they're going to start building barbed wire fences. They're going to start fencing off their land. So that's going to slow the cattle drives down as well. Well, what's pulling all these homesteaders act? Well, it's free land. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, and this federal law incentivized more and more settlement in the West by white Americans and immigrants. And they settled the Midwest, they settled the plains, and all they had to do under the Homestead Act was go out, settle the land, make some improvements, and live on it for 5 years, and they would get 160 acres of land free. And so, like I said, the government, through their legislation, through their support of the railroads, they are essentially pushing us to the end of the American frontier. And the amount of settlement that goes on, the amount of people moving out, the expansion of the railroads, the expansion of markets is essentially going to lead us to a point in 1890 where Frederick Jackson Turner is going to write his frontier thesis, where he says that the frontier is closed. And he is going to argue that the closing of the frontier is negative for the United States, because the frontier always represented an avenue to deal with American discontent. If you're not happy where you are in Georgia or Missouri or, New York, there was always someplace you could go and start fresh. If you screwed up in Tennessee, you can start over in Nevada. There was always hope on the western horizon. But now that the frontier is closed, Turner's going to say we have lost part of our identity, because the frontier had always been a class leveler. There was no upper class, lower class, middle class. Everybody was equal because everyone was struggling to build, struggling to start new. So the closing of the frontier, not a good thing for America. It also was not a good thing for Native Americans. You know, we'd had the reservation system, and the government had a policy of assigning specific territories or tracts of land to individual Native American tribes. As the further west we moved, we kept assigning more and more land and saying, okay, this is your land. No one's going to bother you here. And then we showed up. And okay, we're going to move you over here, but this is your land and no one's going to bother you. And then we showed up. And we just kept moving them further and further west. And as we moved them further and further west, the tracts of land that the government was getting was becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. The natives continued to migrate, but the lands they were migrating to became smaller. And so you're going to see pushback from the Plains Indians, specifically the Sioux and the Comanche. They are going to start fighting against this system. They're going to take up arms against the settlers and their soldiers, and that's going to lead to full-scale war on the western frontier. And the Sioux Wars in 1866 are probably the most famous wars because it's that during the Sioux Wars that you have the famous the Battle of Little Bighorn, the famous last stand of George Armstrong Custer. But that was just one of the wars. There were Native American wars going on between different Native American tribes and the U.S. government for, starting in 1860 throughout the Civil War and all the way into the 1880s. So this was going on for some period of time. In 1871, Congress is going to pass another law trying to maintain or control the relationship or direct the relationship between the U.S. government and the Native Americans. They're going to pass the Indian Appropriation Act, 1871. And essentially what they said is, you know what? We're just going to end all federal recognition of Native American sovereignty. And if you go back to Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court said that Native American tribes were independent nations living within the nation of the United States. The Indian Appropriation Act said, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. We don't recognize your sovereignty, and we're going to just nullify all the treaties we've had up until this point. War is going to continue as a result of this with the Sioux. War is going to continue with the Comanche. This is going to go on for some time until we get to about 1890. Now, throughout all this time, let me back up just a little bit. Before we get to 1890, I want to talk about 1887, because the last-ditch effort of the government to build a Native American policy was the assimilation movement of the 1880s. And here they passed the Dawes Act in 1887. And what the Dawes Act did was it broke up all of these tribal organizations. And they argued that this is going to stop, or this is going to bring an end to the violent Indian resistance, and we're going to force the Native Americans to assimilate into American culture. And we believed it to benefit the Native Americans. We believed that it would help them, because if we could help them assimilate into American culture, that would allow for them to thrive. And we truly believe that. You would thrive if you would just assimilate and become like us. And so essentially the Dawes Act was passed. And what the Dawes Act did was it forced Native Americans into individuals rather than allowing them to gain their identity from their tribes, from their communal relationships. And the properties of the Dawes Act were very similar to the Homestead Act. We took all the Native American lands, we divided them up into 160-acre plots. We gave those plots to the Native Americans and said, if you just live here, if you farm them like we want you to, and you settle on there and you assimilate into American culture, we will not only let you keep this land, but we'll give you American citizenship. And that was the attempt of the Dawes Act to deal with the Native American issues. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. Finally, that takes us to 1890. 1890 technically marks not only the end of the frontier in America, but it marks the end of the Native American conflict with America, if you can believe that. essentially what's happening is there was a movement through the Native American tribes of the West called the Ghost Dance movement. This was a religious movement that actually sprung up almost as an alternative to the violence, to the wars, because the wars weren't working. Essentially what the Ghost Dance movement was, you had a prophet who had a dream, who said if the Native Americans would practice this ghost dance, if they would, include it in their worship and everything, that would draw their ancestors from the grave. And once all their ancestors returned, they would be able to reclaim their lands. Well, this movement starts spreading through all of the Native American Western tribes, and it honestly made the government nervous. So they started to order the military to stop the ghost dance from occurring. It's going to come to a head in December of 1890 at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, when an old man got up and started to perform the ghost dance. When the soldiers tried to stop him, tried to disarm him, something happened. A gun went off, soldiers fired into the crowd, and a number of Native Americans were massacred. Wounded Knee is typically used as the final nail in the coffin of the Native American existence on the Western frontier. And so, 1890, the frontier closes. 1890, Native American resistance technically comes to an end. And so, all of that occurs. You're going to also see during this time, a lot is happening during, with this idea. Because while all this is happening, you're going to start to see farmers in the north, farmers in the west. You're going to start to see this rise of cash crops. Agriculture has been mechanized, and you're going to see this rise of agricultural industry. The problem is with the mechanization of agriculture, the small farmers just can't keep up with it. They can't produce what the larger farms are doing, and these industrial agricultural trusts start to be formed. It's almost like monopolies for the farmers, if you will. And they keep, because of the formation of these trusts, you see manufactured goods become more and more expensive. And the farmers relied on manufactured goods. And not only that, the railroad corporations, the farmers relied on the railroads to get their goods to markets. And the railroad rates keep going up and up. And the farmers are just like, we are getting left behind. This is going to spur a movement among the farmers called the National Grange Movement. And the National Grange Movement actually started as a social movement among farmers, but it's going to grow into an economic and then later a political movement by the farmers. The Grange is going to defend farmers locally as well as regionally against the effects of the industrial trust, the monopolies. It's going to help defend the farmers against the up and down prices of the railroads. The Grange is actually going to be successful in getting some laws passed to protect farmers, to protect them from price gouging, to make sure that railroad rates are published and available for view at any time, to prevent special favors going to people who ship large shipments and stuff like that. So they do get some work done, and they're also part of the movement that gets the Interstate Commerce Act passed in 1866. And what the Interstate Commerce Act did was it ordered railroads to keep their rates low and just, and to keep things fair. The Interstate Commerce Act is also going to start working against child labor, and it's going to start working against the trusts that are being built, the monopolies that are being built, stuff like that. So anyway, so that's important. So just keep that in mind, and keep the National Grange Movement in the back of your head, because we're going to move on to big idea number 6. And I'm going to take a break here. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat there. But I haven't seen any questions, so let me go ahead. And there is one big idea that is not on my sheet that I'm going to have to circle back around. So remind me to talk to you guys about the New South, okay? So let's go big idea number 6. Various groups are going to seeking to reform American society and economics into a more economical or equitable reality. All right, here we go. This, we're talking essentially about American society during the Gilded Age. And American society is going to be defined by urbanization and suburbanization. Urbanization, what we're going to see is a lot of people are going to start moving into the cities. In fact, 40% of Americans lived in the cities during the Gilded Age, and they're going to live in what were called tenements. These are hastily built apartment buildings that would house several families in one room. They were very cheaply made. They were very dangerous to live in. I mean, a simple match and the whole thing could go up. But that, we didn't have specific structure to build cities. And, when we built cities, we didn't have plans to do that. And these tenements went up very quickly because the owners of these tenements could make a lot of money with the rent and everything like that. So picture Americans moving into the city, picture immigrants coming to the cities, and tenements were everywhere. Now, you did have that middle class that I talked about earlier. They're going to start living outside. They're going to live on the outskirts of the city. And that's when we're going to start seeing the rise of suburbs, or the suburbanization of America. It's not real huge yet, but we're seeing the beginnings of suburbs in America at that point. And a suburb is nothing more than a community outside the skirts of the city. We're going to see a lot of cultural changes during this time. Theater, entertainment, all of that is going to start playing into American society. The circus is going to become something big during this time. Spectator sports, baseball, that's when baseball is going to start becoming the national pastime, is during this time period, during the Gilded Age. So that's kind of what society was like at this time. Let's talk a little bit more about other things going on in the cities. Let's talk about politics in the cities. You can't talk about politics in the Gilded Age without talking about political machines. Political machines were the power base of urban centers. They were networks for political and economic loyalty. Essentially, you had a political machine where you had a political boss, like a boss Tweed, and they essentially controlled the political movement of that city. They did that by working with immigrants and gaining their trust and gaining their votes. And once they were able to control the vote, they were able to control the government. And that was the purpose of the political machine. And so you can imagine the type of corruption that spread out of these political machines, because once they had control of government, they could do whatever they want, and they could build whatever they want, and they could line their pockets, and they could make a fortune doing it. So you had that going on. With regards to the folks living in the tenements, even though they were living in these rat-infested areas, there was hope. There were people who were working to try to make their lives better. You had the settlement house movement that's going to start during the Gilded Age and carry into the Progressive era. Hull House by Jane Addams, that's the best example you can use. They offered social services to predominantly immigrant working class, but also those who were living in poverty as well. The women's movement is going to kick off in society again during the Gilded Age. They kind of took a back seat during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now they're going to kick back in. And we're going to see the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association. That was formed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. They're going to be fighting for the right for women to vote. And so the fight for women's voting is going to start to catch on again. The temperance movement is going to kick back in during this time. You're going to see the WCTU form, the Women's Christian Temperance Union form. You're going to see the Anti-Saloon League form, led by people like Carrie Nation, who, and her Hatchinations, who would take their little hatchets and go break up the bars and stuff. So you see these movements starting to spring up again during the Gilded Age. And then, of course, you had the social gospel movement being introduced during this time as well. And the social gospel movement was the movement of middle-class progressive Christians coming together to advocate for social justice, to help help build reform throughout the urban communities, as part of their Christian duty. They're saying it's time for the Christians to step up and start doing their part, to be the hands, to be the feet of Jesus, and that's what the social gospel movement was all about. So that's a real quick and a flash overview of society during this time period. But I want to talk more about politics. Big idea number 7. Politics in the Gilded Age continued to resemble party divisions lingering from the Civil War, and they contended the proper place of government in American life. I mentioned the political machines in the cities. There was a lot of corruption in politics during the Gilded Age. Remember, the government is using laissez-faire policies, hands off, and they want a very limited government presence in the lives of Americans. That opens them up to the propensity of corruption going forward. The major political parties during this time, the Republicans and the Democrats. Okay? The Republicans were typically supported by middle-class businessmen, by Protestants, and by African Americans. The Democrats on the other side, they were more centered around big city political machines, the immigrants, as well as white Southerners. So those are your divisions. Because of the political machines, because of limited government, you saw a lot of patronage. You saw the spoil system in high motion during this time period. And remember, understand this word, patronage refers to when a party who wins elections starts doling out federal jobs and contracts to all of their loyal supporters. So what this leads to is an issue with civil service reform. It all comes to a head in 1880 when President James Garfield is assassinated by someone who thought he was owed a job because he supported him when he was running for president. Charles Guiteau is going to assassinate James Garfield. When the spoil system, when political patronage can lead to a point where a president is assassinated, we need to do something about it. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass the Pendleton Act of 1881. And what the Pendleton Act is going to do is create a civil service exam that employees of the government have to take in order to get their job. You have to prove what you know in order to get a job in government. It's no longer going to be about who you know, but what you know. The government also, while they're dealing with civil service reform, they're also dealing with the economy. They're dealing with the currency of our nation, and at that point we were under the gold standard. You're going to have farmers and others who are going to push for a secondary standard of coinage, and that's going to be the silver standard, because the more you build up the money supply, the more money is available for loans. And typically what happens, the formula is simple. Farmers really push to increase the money supply because as the money supply goes up, as more money is in circulation, interest rates are going to drop because the value of the dollar is going to drop. But that's going to cause inflation. And when you have inflation, prices are going to go up. And that's going to help the farmers. So that's why there was this big push to increase the money supply, to create inflation, to create increased prices. It's a short-term solution. It doesn't sustain the economy. But the farmers and a lot of people who supported this, they didn't care. They just needed to get prices up so they could start making some profits. So they're pushing for the unlimited coinage of silver. At the same time, the banks, the businesses, they want to maintain the gold standard because that way money will hold its value. And actually you see deflation. And prices will go down, but interest rates will start to go up a little bit. So you have these two sides going back and forth. You're going to go through several different forms of legislation to determine the coinage of silver. You're going to have the Bland-Allison Act that starts coining silver at 16-1. You're going to have the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which it's not going to set up unlimited coinage, but what it is going to do is it's going to guarantee that the government's going to buy a certain amount of silver every single month. And the only thing you can do with silver is coin it. So all of that's going on. At the same time, businesses are pushing for support, and they're going to start pushing for tariffs. They want tariffs because tariffs are going to build up prices for American industry. So when tariffs are put in place, essentially, and at this point in history, tariffs make up half of the revenue that our government is making. But the tariffs, while it helps industry, it hurts the farmers. And the farmers are going to start to suffer. Consumers are going to start to suffer. Put all this together. Put the coinage of silver, put this idea of tariffs, and that National Grains Unit, that union that supported the farmers, is going to start bringing in more support. The farmers are going to start joining together with the unions, and other people are going to start looking, and this is all going to come together and form a brand new political party called the Populist Party or the People's Party. And they believed, what the populists believed, is that you had this concentration of economic power that is held by businesses and government, and they want to rebalance the economic power of our country. And so they're going to introduce what's known as the Omaha Platform. Now, the Omaha Platform evolved from a previous platform called the Ocala Platform. Now, I'm trying not to confuse you, but the Ocala platform was the platform created by the National Grange. And that is going to evolve and then join together with the Omaha Platform. The Omaha Platform is the political platform of the Populist Party. So it takes all of these ideas that the farmers built in the National Grange, and they combine it with all these ideas that the unions want, and they bring that together, the Ocala Platform and the union desires, and they create the Omaha Platform. And some of the key moments or the key ingredients of the Omaha Platform included the direct election of senators, initiatives and referendums, some more democracy for the American people, unlimited coinage of silver, graduated income tax, the 8-hour workday, immigration restrictions. All that stuff is going to come together. And the Populist Party is going to form. You're going to see a Populist Party president run in the election of 1892. James Weaver. Now, he doesn't win. Grover Cleveland's going to win that election, but the ideas of the Populist Party continue on, and they continue to grow. And there's a politician by the name of William Jennings Bryan, and he is going to embrace the Populist Platform. Now, he's a Democrat. And in embracing the populist platform, he becomes an attractive candidate for the Democratic Party because they saw that the Populist Party had influence in the election of 1892. And they want that influence, but they want it under the Democratic banner. So what's going to happen is they're going to bring in William Jennings Bryan as their Democratic candidate in the election of 1896. And he's going to be running against William McKinley. Now, what's so important about the election of 1896 is this is when William Jennings Bryan gives his very famous Cross of Gold speech. And his Cross of Gold speech, he basically said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of the labor this crown of thorns. You shall not nail us to this cross of gold." And essentially, he's using imagery from the crucifixion of Jesus in Christianity to basically talk about the seriousness that he felt about bimetallism. Well, Christians are not having any of this. They're looking at this saying, "You've got to be kidding. You're using the sacred parts of our, the central parts of our faith, and you're belittling it by using it to describe economics." So he's going to get pushback from the Christians, but he is still running for the office and everything. That's what he sticks to. That's what he is going to run on. He is going to end up losing to William McKinley. McKinley had a very organized campaign run by Mark Hanna. He's going to run what's known as the Front Porch Campaign from Ohio, and he will win the election. And what he's going to start is the modern presidency that we know today. He'll be the first modern president, and so we'll talk a little bit more about McKinley here in just a few minutes. But essentially, what's going to happen is, when McKinley gets elected, we're going to come across a lot of gold discoveries that's going to pump up our gold reserves, which were depleted during the Panic of 1893. America starts to enter into a time period of prosperity, and really for the next 30 years, you're going to have essentially Republican rule over an economically prosperous United States. Again, that's the next time period, but that's what's happening here. All right, we're moving on because I do have big idea number 8, which does talk about the New South, and we absolutely need to talk about this. So big idea number 8 essentially says, despite significant efforts to create a New South, the Southern states entrenched themselves in racial segregation and a continuing adherence to agriculture. Coming out of the Civil War, an editorial was written by Henry Grady. And Henry Grady is going to push for this vision he had of a New South. It was a vision for a post-Civil War South that was based on economic diversity, industrial growth, as well as laissez-faire capitalism. He essentially said the reason why the South lost the Civil War is because they had no industry. So we need to bring industry into the South. We need to diversify the economy of the South. So the Southern states aren't as dependent on industrial states, and they too can become self-sufficient. What's going to happen, though, is though there is industry that's going to be introduced into the South. I mean, Birmingham, Alabama becomes a major steel production center. And, where Pittsburgh was the number one steel producing center in the country, Birmingham became number 2. In fact, they called it the Pittsburgh of the South. So there was industry that moved into the South, but most people still maintained the agricultural economy that they had known forever. And so what's going to happen, though, is you need people to work in this agricultural-based economy. And since slavery has been, abolished, we need workers. Well, the freedmen, they need jobs. And they don't have much negotiating power. And that's going to lead us into agricultural production through what was called sharecropping, which essentially was another version of economic slavery. Because once you became a sharecropper, you basically were in debt to the landowner. And it was next to impossible to get out of debt. You were consistently increasing your debt, and yet your crops that you were bringing in, they could never cover that cost. So that's why sharecropping is also seen as a form of slavery, albeit economic slavery. Now, what we're going to see is not only do we see slavery kind of re-existing in the South, we're also going to see the ways of the Old South back in play. You're going to have a lot of pushback against the freedmen and government involvement in the South, and you're going to see segregation start to grow. During the Reconstruction era, we had the Black Codes. During the Gilded Age, we had the Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow essentially codified or made segregation legal in the South. And segregation was used as a system of economic and political oppression. One of the major cases you need to know, major Supreme Court case you need to know, is the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation is legal, according to their interpretation of the Constitution. And the idea of separate but equal came out of this decision. The idea that you can have separate facilities for different races as long as they're equal. And so that's what the Supreme Court based their ruling on. Now, we know that separate but equal was just a myth. Things were separate, but they were by no means equal. But the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, is going to be the standard or the status quo throughout the South until the 1950s, and really even beyond that. And we'll get to that in our next unit. We're also going to have the rise of an organization called the KKK during this time, who use the horrendous crime of lynching. Lynching is going to become the primary tool of the KKK. The response to this is you are going to have people step up, and they're going to start talking out against it. One of the most vocal people against lynching that was going on in the South is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was an African-American journalist. She is also what we consider a muckraker, and she attempted to bring attention to what was happening in the South, to the lynchings, to the racism that was occurring, and she tried to bring that to the attention of the general public. And she will get their attention, but she's also going to get the attention of the KKK. And what's essentially going to happen is she's, her press and her newspaper that she had in Tennessee is going to be bombed and destroyed, and she's going to have to move north with her family. But she continues to write. She continues to share what's happening in Jim Crow South during this time. You're also going to see the rise of people like Henry Turner. Henry Turner is going to start the International Migration Society. The purpose of the International Migration Society was to provide passage to freedmen who wanted to move back to Africa, to move back to Liberia. I mean, it was an attempt, but when the folks got back there, they realized there wasn't much for them there either. And so it didn't have much success. But two other key leaders are going to come out of this time period that you absolutely need to know. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These two men are going to be part of the African American movement fighting for civil rights. We're starting to see the seeds of change being planted in the civil rights movement that's going to start to grow through the 20th century. Both these men called for black self-sufficiency. They wanted legal protection against the terrorism they were facing in the South, and they wanted to make sure that their rights were protected by the U.S. government. Now, they had different approaches to how this was going to be accomplished. Booker T. Washington believed that education would lead to economic self-sufficiency, and once blacks reached economic self-sufficiency, then their voice would be listened to. But the inequality, the inequality in these political fights were useless. They had no, there was no footing that they could gain because no one was listening to African Americans because they weren't self-sufficient. That's the argument that Booker T. Washington made. So he said, get the education that will help alleviate you, get you out of the position you're in now, and then people will listen. W.E.B. Du Bois said, no, we need political rights now because we're American citizens now, so we should have these rights now. So these political fights should continue. These two men are the two men you need to know from this time period. So make sure you know about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay? I think that's it for the Gilded Age. Let me check my screen. All right, yeah. So I'm going to take you now to... did I jump? Yeah, I'm going to take you now to this big idea here that I added in. I don't have any more after this, right? No, okay. So this is the last one. All right, here it is. The progressive wanted strong government intervention to reform society on the issues like political corruption, social injustice, and economic equality. So now what I'm doing is I'm jumping into our next time period. The progressives is actually part of time period 7, but I think it just mirrors up to the Gilded Age. That's why we teach it with the Gilded Age, because the progressive era is a response to all the garbage that was going on during the Gilded Age. So the issues that concerned the progressives, when we start talking about the progressives, what they were concerned about. They were concerned about the rising power of big business. They were concerned about the uncertainties in the economy. I mean, we're just coming out of the Panic of 1893, going into the 20th century. We don't want to see that happen again. There were increasingly violent conflicts between labor and businesses. You had the political machines running rampant in the cities. You had Jim Crow laws in the South. You had segregation. That segregation continued in the South. The rights of women still were not being, brought to the attention of government. And so you had all of this going on, and the progressive movement is going to bring this diverse group of people together, such as Protestants, feminists, unions, black activists, and others, to fight to bring American society to a better place. They're going to fight to reform American society, and they realize that we do need government intervention for this. One of the ways they got the word out was through the muckrakers. Muckrakers were investigative journalists, and these were people who attempted to expose corporate corruption, the mistreatment of workers, to shed lights on the problems of the poor and the urban and the predominantly immigrant communities. We talked about Ida B. Wells just a minute ago, but other muckrakers, Ida Tarbell, who's going to go after Standard Oil and J.D. Rockefeller, Jacob Riis, who's going to publish the book How the Other Half Lives. That was a photographic representation or novel of the poverty in the New York City slums. Upton Sinclair is going to write a book called The Jungle about the nastiness of our meat packing plants and how it wasn't just meat going into that meat. It was a lot of other nasty stuff that Americans were eating, and it was causing a lot of disease. And so what these muckrakers did was they alerted America to the dangers of the social inequalities, to the corruption that was going on, and they wanted to create reform. So they were the spark that leads Americans to want reform in our country. There's a guy by the name of Frederick Taylor, and I don't think I shared his name with my class, but I did talk today about the scientific management of industry and government. And Frederick Taylor is going to introduce this, that there's a more efficient way that factories can run and save a lot of money. Well, he says you can do that in government as well. And so we're going to see government start changing during this time. We're going to see government reform at the city level, at the state level, and at the national level. So we're going to see that going on. The presidents during the Progressive Era starts with Teddy Roosevelt, and then William Howard Taft, and then Woodrow Wilson. And what these men did as the presidents of this era is they're going to oversee the growth of government and its involvement in the different aspects of society. Everyone working to make society better. Couple things you want to do. Teddy Roosevelt's going to be probably the most active as all of them. And he sets an agenda after William McKinley is assassinated. He's going to come in to set an agenda that was called the Square Deal. It was to set up consumer protection laws, to set up conservation laws, and also to get control of these monopolies that were running industry and business in our country. And so through his act, we're going to see a number of laws being passed. For consumer protection, the Pure Food and Drug Act is going to be passed along with the Meat Inspection Act. For the conservationists, he is going to pass the Forest Reserve Act that's going to set aside millions of acres for national forests. And to go after these monopolies and their control, Teddy Roosevelt's going to become known as the trust buster because he's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to tear down, or not to tear down, but to regulate these monopolies, to take power away from them. But remember, Roosevelt, when he was looking at these monopolies, like we talked about today, he saw good trust and he saw bad trust. He goes, I want to focus on getting rid of the bad ones, but we got to keep the good ones. We just need to do it with regulations. And what we're going to see during the Progressive Era is you're going to see this diverse group of American citizens working together to make society better. You're going to see the rise of the social gospel movement. That's going to continue. The settlement house movement is going to continue. And while average Americans are working to make society better, government's going to get more involved. The laissez-faire policies of government is going to start to ease away, and government is going to start flexing its muscle a little bit more and saying, we need to work to make this country better. That's it. Okay? That's the end of the Progressive Era. That's the end of my big ideas that I need to talk about. I don't see anybody in the chat at all. I got a few of you still with me right now. And, we've been going at this, an hour and 20 minutes. That's not too bad. So my question is, do you have any questions that I can answer for you? With regards to the Gilded Age, with regards to the Progressive Era, anything that you need help with understanding. It's a lot of information. I realize that. But if you just take it in a systematic approach, kind of like we did with the big ideas, I think it's easier to manage. There is some connection, obviously, between the big ideas, but a lot of it is just a systematic approach. So I'm kind of sitting here, I'm kind of, filibustering a little bit to see if any questions come out. But if not, I'll go ahead and shut things down. But go ahead, throw them out there at me. Questions, comments, concerns. What can I tell you? The boys are here with me. I don't know if they want to make an appearance tonight. It's a little bit more difficult with this screen here, but we'll see if they can make an appearance. But let's see. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So I'm assuming you guys know everything you need to know about the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So, all right, I'm just going to give it another minute here or so. Let me see if Flynn will get up here. Come here, Flynn. You want to come up? Come here. Come on. You're Gilligan. Come on, get here. Gilligan's going to come up. Let's see if you can see Gilligan. There's Gilligan. Gilligan's getting a little bit more, he's getting a little bit more of the public persona. He wants to come and be seen by people. So Gilligan's here. Flynn's getting a little jealous. Let's see if we can get Flynn up here. Come on, Flynn, you come up. Here's Flynn. Flynn's here too. So both the boys making an appearance for you guys tonight. Okay, I think that's going to do it because I'm not seeing any questions, so I am going to say I covered it all for you. You're good to go. You're ready for the exam tomorrow. If you're not in my class and you're just watching because you like history, well, thank you very much for watching. If you have an exam coming up on Unit 6, I hope this helps you. But other than that, we're going to call it a night. I say thank you for watching, and we will see you tomorrow. All right? Be good. Bye-bye.